begin at the beginning. We're going to talk about this amazing artifact that literally just was announced about a month or so ago, by a colleague of mine, Dr. Scott Stripling, who is the current dig director at Shiloh in Israel, and the team is actually there right now in their week 2 of excavating ancient Shiloh. And so, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to kind of tease you for a moment, then we're going to come back and talk about archaeology and artifacts, really what archaeology is, because so far in the conference, we've heard a lot from geologists and scientists. So let's bring this back down to earth and talk about dirt and artifacts. And that's really what this is all about. We deal with artifacts in archaeology. So in 2020, I think right before COVID hit, I think it was 2020, right before COVID hit, Scott took a team, not a large team, he took a fairly small team of researchers with him to the West Bank area, the modern day city of Nablus, and there are 2 peaks right overlooking the ancient site of Shechem. And if you know your biblical geography and if you've ever been to Israel, you know that the 2 peaks between Shechem are Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. These are the 2 mountains that Joshua he basically took the Israelites there and renewed the covenant with God at Shechem, right there on Mount Ebal and Mount Shechem. And he had 2. One was the Blessings Mountain, Mount Gerizim. As you're standing at Shechem, you're looking at Mount Gerizim, it would be on the right, and then on the left would be Mount Ebal. That is the Blessings Mountain, and the Curses Mountain is on the left. So what Scott did was, because he knew the archaeology of the area, the Curses Mountain, Mount Ebal, actually contained an altar. And the altar is actually built on top of a smaller altar, stratum 1, that dates to 1250 BC. The stratum 1 or stratum 2 dates to 1406, and stratum 1 is 1250. So this is a very, very, very early altar. In fact, this altar dates to the time of Joshua, based on the chronology that we follow in the Old Testament. And what Scott's team did was, in this top altar, so there was an ancient altar, round altar, and then on top of that was built a rectangular altar. And this altar was excavated by an Israeli archaeologist named Adam Zertal. And Zertal took his debris, it's called a dump pile. It sounds horrible to call it that, but that's what it is. Like, archaeologists call it a dump pile. He took the dump pile and they put it and they stack it around the area. So what Scott did in 2020 is he took his team and he took the dump pile that was on top of these altars, these ancient altars on Mount Ebal. And what he discovered is this cursed tablet that dates back literally to the time, possibly to the time of Joshua. What's remarkable about it is it's actually composed of lead, and it has writing on it. It has Hebrew writing. And the initial analysis of this is the oldest Hebrew writing ever discovered in Israel. Ever discovered. And you know what it says? It's talking about curses. Curse, curse, curses. Cursed are you if you don't keep the covenant. And it also contains, get this folks, the name Yahweh. The earliest written textual record of Yahweh in the land of Israel, found on the Curses Mountain, on the altar site in Israel. Is that not awesome? That's pretty awesome. So this is quite remarkable in many, many ways. It has tremendous implications for multiple things. This is the stratum 1 altar excavated by Adam Zertal, and what you see there on the middle of that, apparently, of course, obviously these are probably Jews who are building this, going back to commemorate this site. They're building an altar site on top of this ancient altar site that's around, very likely, Joshua's circular altar found in stratum 2 in the date is 1406 BC. So we're going to talk about this and the significance. What I want you to give you is that we're going to come back to it in a moment, but I want to give you the broader archaeological context of the significance of this discovery and the implications of what this means for Old Testament archaeology, for archaeology in Israel, period. This is huge, and it has ripple effects. Now, I did an interview with Scott. That's where you actually saw this. Robert saw this. I did an interview with Scott Stripling, who actually led this team. And what they did was they took the dump pile from these altars and they wet sifted them. Now, archaeologists, we do two kinds of sifting. We do dry sifting, and so if you've ever been to an archaeological site, you have the screen and you have the team members, they shake the screen and the dirt comes through this, and you see little things in it. Well, you can find a lot by dry sifting, but when you wet sift a site with a really fine mesh in a grid, you can find all kinds of other little small things. In fact, I brought two examples. There's a scarab there from Thutmose III, which that's interesting in and of itself. That's very likely one of the Exodus pharaohs. This is an actual scarab from the Ptolemaic period, so the time of right after the death of Alexander the Great. That's how small it is. That's an actual Egyptian scarab, and in fact, you can see it afterwards. I'll let you hold it, look at it, but you literally, it looks like a piece of dirt. If it's got dirt on it, you really can't even see it. So if you're wet sifting it, you can see. So when they're sifting through this stuff, the tablet didn't look like a tablet until the water was placed on it. And then Frankie Snyder, who is an Israeli who lives in Jerusalem, she actually discovered the actual cursed tablet. And I'm going to show you what the cursed tablet actually is here in just a moment. But let me just say a couple of quick things about archaeology and just some sort of some general things here, because I want to give you the broader archaeological and biblical and historical context for this, to let you know sort of the track record of the Old Testament when it comes to historical reliability and archaeological reliability. So let's start with just the basics, the real. Let's just get some housekeeping things in order here, and talk about the real basic things. All of these things we're talking about, whether it's the conquest of Joshua, whether it's the Exodus, whether it's Moses in Egypt, whether it is whatever it is in the Old Testament, and the speaker before was mentioning the gospel and Christ dying on the cross and then being buried and then rising again. That event, which is central to the New Testament, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, is an event that took place in the past. So it is a historical event. So the question then is, how do we know the past? It is a really basic question, but it's a fundamental question when it comes to understanding the relationship between artifacts, historical records, and eyewitness accounts. And so that's really what I want to real quickly just kind of go over real quick before we get into this. And that is how do we access the past? Because the past is, whether it's 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, we have to access the past in some way. So how do we access the past? The best explanation I can give is, years ago, my son was homeschooled, and we were on this, he was on this thing about looking at the wreck of the Titanic. Like, we were watching a lot of documentaries of the Titanic. And it's a fascinating thing when you see this huge ship go down. And it was at that moment that I had a little light bulb moment come on, and I thought, because at the time I was actually teaching a seminary class in biblical archaeology, and I thought, I'm going to use this to explain. It's a great way to explain primary sources. So here it is, really, really easy. There's three things I want you to remember. If you don't remember anything else, remember these three things. We know the past through three primary sources: eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. Eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. And I can give you dozens of examples of that, but I'm going to give you one for my own family. So growing up as a kid, my mom would take me down to southern Arkansas on the border of Texas. My grandparents lived down there, and they had a farm down there. And I remember as a kid growing up hearing stories about my grandfather being in this war, and he would tell me stories about being in the war. And I thought, well, I guess he was in this really, I didn't know what war it was. I was like 9, 10, 11 years old. And as I got older, I finally dawned on me what war he was in. You know what he did? I just like, when I had that moment, I was like, what? He was in D-Day, June 6, 1944. Not like around D-Day, he was at D-Day. He drove a landing barge on D-Day. If you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, you know the boats that land on the beach. My grandfather drove a landing barge on D-Day. He was an eyewitness to D-Day. So this is the first element in how do we know the past. Someone had to have seen some event. And of course, then they write their record down. And my grandfather wrote his account down in his Navy Blue Jackets manual. So multiple years ago, my grandfather passed away. My grandmother gave me his Blue Jackets manual. So now we have a historical record. We have a written account of my grandfather. In fact, he has one page in his diary where it says he was wet and cold the entire day, and he lists the time that he got up. And he had the date, June 6, 1944, Normandy, and he underlined it 3 times, and it was exclamation point. So he was at D-Day. So here we have a historical record. And the third thing we have when it comes to reconstructing the past is we have archaeological evidence. And you can actually go to D-Day, you can go to Normandy today, and you can still find evidence of the Normandy invasion. So here's the catch though. What do you do though when the eyewitnesses are no longer alive? Well, you can't interview the eyewitness. My grandfather's now passed away. The only thing we have left are what? Historical records and archaeological evidence. And you can actually compare and contrast what the text says with what we actually find in the ground. And I'm here to say that the Bible has a remarkable track record when it comes to archaeological and historical evidence. You've heard a lot of great evidence today about for the flood and for genetics and things like that. Well, I'm going to talk about evidence for the reliability of the Old Testament. And we're just scratching the surface because there's just so much here. So I want to give you the broader context of this discovery of this Mount Ebal inscription. So, and this is something that I'm familiar with because I actually helped excavate this site. This is called Khirbet el Maqader. It's an Arabic word. Khirbet means ruin. And there are 2 basic kinds of archaeological sites in Israel. There's the Khirbet, and there is the Tel. You may have heard of the Tel Megiddo, Tel Jericho, things like that. And it's literally just an artificial mound of dirt of cities that have been built over time. A Khirbet is actually more of a ruin that's sort of lying on the surface. And a very famous Khirbet that I know you've heard of is Khirbet Qumran, which is where the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were found right near Khirbet Qumran. So that was in 2014 where I was assistant square supervisor. And so there are archaeological requirements for Ai if we're going to locate Ai. We believe that this, in fact, not just myself, but the man the team who discovered this site was my colleague at ABR, and ABR stands for Associates for Biblical Research, and I'm an associate with ABR. And Dr. Bryant Wood actually looked for the site and tried to look at what the Bible states about where Ai is, and he looked at possible locations of where the site could be. And what he says, I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly, and if you want the slides, I'll give them to you later. But these are just a few of these. I think there are about 12 in particular. It must be occupied at the time of the conquest, 15th century BC, at the end of the late Bronze Age period. It must be fortified at the time of the conquest. It must have a gate on the north of the site, and it must be destroyed by fire. And then it was left in ruins after it was destroyed, according to the text, according to the supposed eyewitness accounts of Joshua. And there are a few more geographical requirements. It must be adjacent to Beth Aven, must be east of Bethel, must be an ambush site between Bethel and Ai, and there must be a militarily significant hill north of Ai, and then it must be a shallow valley north of Ai, and it must be smaller than Gibeon and in the vicinity of Bethel. So there are a few possible sites that have arisen in the past few years as to the location of the biblical site of Ai. The candidate number 1 is a place called Et Tel, and this is a very famous site that was excavated by the founder of ABR, Dr. David Livingston, for many, many years. Looked for archaeological evidence at the site called Et Tel. But the problem is it only meets 3, maybe 4 of the possible 12 biblical and archaeological requirements for the site being the actual site. The second site is, my battery's going dead here, is a site called Khirbet Nissa. which meets 5 of the 12 requirements. There is a third site, though, and at the time, this is over 20 years ago now, it had never been explored except when Dr. Brian Wood took a few people with him and did a survey of this site. And he took Gary Byers, and I think he took Ed Kozeminski and some other people with him. And this site is called Khirbet El Makata. It meets all 12 biblical requirements, every single one, to a T. And so they excavated there for, it's really considered to be a salvage excavation, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So just to show you there, this is a map of the area. This is in the West Bank, by the way, and it's about 9 miles north of Jerusalem. And so you've got Khirbet Nissa there. There's one possible location. There's Bethel, El Bira. This is the modern-day city of Ramallah, by the way. This is where Yasser Arafat from the PLO, y'all remember the PLO? Yasser Arafat is buried there. Then there's Bethel, and then I got a couple others here. And then there's Et Tel. You see how close they are? There's Et Tel right there, and there's Khirbet El Makata. So Et Tel just did not fit the requirements. And then Dr. Wood went, and this is actually in 2014. We parked right here, the bus did, and we had to hike down this little trail here, and then walk over here, cross the road, and it's on a ridge, up on a really high ridge overlooking the site. Right there on the top of the ridge, there is a 4th century Byzantine pilgrimage church overlooking the site. In fact, it's the highest point in that area. In fact, it may be actually where Abraham built an altar between Bethel and Ai on that very spot. That's why, in fact, Scott and some of the other team members that I'm with actually believe that that's why the Byzantine Christians built a church over that spot, because it very likely could commemorate the spot where Abraham built the altar to God. And it's kind of hard to see in this picture here, but excavation at an archaeological site begins very early in the morning. We begin at 5:30 a.m. And we get to the site, and you really can't see it. It's kind of hard to see it. These are actually the dump piles from previous excavations at Khirbet El Makata. And this is the Arab city of Deir Dawan, just to the south of this. This is in contested Palestinian territory. So isn't it interesting that this biblical site, where Joshua is conquering a Canaanite city and taking Canaan back from the Canaanites, because that's a whole controversial thing even today. And so, isn't it interesting that it's right here in this contested territory today? In fact, when Brian Wood and others, they had to get permission not only from the Israeli Antiquities Authority to dig the site, they also had to get permission from the Palestinian Authority as well. And on the site, even when I was there in 2014 excavating, we actually had Palestinians excavating with us at the site. I got a picture of one of my buddies there. And we also had undercover Israeli IDF soldiers with machine guns, no kidding, at the site with us. And it was a little tense because I was like, hey, I'm just here to dig. Just let me, And but you could visibly see the animosity between the Israelis on the site and the Palestinians on the site, and I won't go to anything. So yeah, this is an actual map of the site, and you see there. This is actually okay. So this is actually configured north. There's the gate. It's a 2-chambered gate, and it's pointing north. And what you see here, folks, is a late Bronze Age Canaanite fortress. And the gate points north. And behind the gate, behind the city here, there's actually a shallow valley that runs about like this, where the laser is. If you remember the story of Joshua's conquest of Ai, remember the Israelites, after the Exodus and after the wilderness wandering for 40 years, Joshua, son of Nun, goes into Canaan, and the first city that he comes to is Jericho. Remember Jericho? You marched around the walls 7 times. The city. I've got there's a whole presentation before this one on Jericho, which if you want to know about it later, I'll show you. But I go from Jericho to Ai to Hatzor, the third site. This one is just the Ai presentation. But basically, if you remember the story, it was a classic ambush. It was basically, what happened was that Joshua was a brilliant military strategist, actually. He split his army up, And it was not a very large site. It didn't have a lot of men in it, but it was a strategic position. And what many military analysts, when they study Joshua's military strategy, what they figured he was doing was actually gaining a foothold in the hill country, because you have advantage when you're in a higher location, which makes sense. Still to this day, you've got that advantage of being in a higher location. So he was conquering these sites that were in these higher elevations. And what he did was, he split his army up, and he actually got on his horse or donkey, whatever he had, and he got on the hill north of Ai, right out of the front of the gate. You can actually stand in that gate and look out of that front gate, and there's a huge hill several kilometers away, just right overlooking it. And then behind it, there is a valley that's covered by trees and by brush. And so he had his second part of his army at night go down in there and hide out. And in the morning, he got a lot of his guys, and he just waved his spear. If you read the biblical account, he waved his spear gleamed in the sun, and the king of Ai said, "Hey, we're going to come get you." They opened the gates up, the army leaves the fortress, and guess what the second part of the army does? They come up behind, they go into the thing, and they burn it, and they destroy it. Done. And that's it. And guess what? That's exactly what we found. It was the late Bronze Age fortress of Ai. There was a battle there, and the site was burned. And we have pottery from the late Bronze Age, that dates exactly to that time frame. The geographical, the archaeological requirements all fit perfectly. So this site right here, I'm going to do some squares here to show you some sites. This is an area here. This is so interesting. During the Second Temple period, during the time of Jesus in the New Testament, the site was reused by Jews, in fact, they built a little village inside the ruins of ancient Ai. Isn't that interesting? And our team...
What does I mean? A-I?
I.
I know. What's the definition or the meaning of it? Just plain the name of the village.
It's just the name of the village, yeah. It's a Canaanite name of the village. I think it's called Ha-I, but I'm not exactly sure what the etymological meaning of it is, but I can find out for you, for sure. But yeah, it is pronounced though. I know for many years many people will pronounce it AI, but I was told by multiple people it's pronounced I, like iPhone, iPad, I. Just say I, like eyeball, I. That's how you pronounce it. And so this site here was excavated by our ABR team. This site here, I'm going to show you a picture of that. This is actually still remaining, the base of this wall here. And this is the late Bronze Age wall. This is square Q10, right there on that corner. That's where I excavated in 2014. And this is the site here. So I'm going to go through some photographs here. This is actually standing on top of the site, the tallest part. And you can see there, this arrow is pointing to the Mount of Olives. So it's 9 miles north of Jerusalem where it is. And this is actually looking there from the top of the mountain. And back below there is the modern Palestinian village of Deir Dawan. These are large houses. And my understanding is that the PLO and other organizations give money to these people so they can build settlements there, and it's still contested today because right down the road there's a Jewish settlement that is surrounded by barbed wire fence, and so it's kind of a very touchy area. But we were there, and it's actually where we were excavating was a sheep pasture, but there's a huge archaeological site there. And this is actually a photograph of Q10 as first day of excavation. The first day we actually remove a lot of rock, so it's not a lot of interesting finds. But this is Muhammad, one of the guys that I excavated with, and this right here, I don't want to go through these again, these squares. This is that gate. So you see there the base, the square of it. That's that left-hand side, and right there through the middle of it is north. And on the other side is the New Testament city that dates back to the New Testament period. It's all written about in Joshua. This is actually the majority of our excavation was actually in the New Testament city. In fact, Dr. Stripling has conjectured, and I don't know if it's been disproven, but it's certainly a very good candidate. There is a New Testament city called Ephraim that Jesus and his disciples went to on the edge of the wilderness, and this could be Ephraim. And you say, well, how do you know it's Jewish? Because we know in Second Temple Judaism, ritual purity of the Jews is a very important thing, and we find mikvot, which are these ritual purity baths on the site in great proliferation. There's several. But this is actually Q10, and we go down, and as we start to get down the layers, what we do is we take the pottery, we put it in a bucket. Each bucket has a number. You record the square, you record the context. Context is the most important thing in archaeology. And archaeology is a destructive science, because once you do it, once you actually take the artifacts out of the ground, they're lost. So you want to know the three most important rules, interestingly, of hermeneutics are context, context, context. And the three most important rules in archaeology are context, context, context. So you want to make sure that you record everything in its proper context. And this is in our square. So you get the pottery there, it's covered in dirt, and then afterwards, well, that's a fun little thing we found there in our square. I'm told, although I did not dig in too close to this, but I'm told that the smaller ones you got to watch out for. It's not the large ones, it's the small ones you got to watch out for. But this is the majority of this is dry sifting here. I was telling you about dry sifting. And these are some students here in part of the New Testament city there that are dry sifting the corner of a building. What they do now is they take some of the more interesting locations, and they'll take that dry sifting material and they'll put it in a wet sifting format, and then they can discover a lot of small micro artifacts. You can find maybe you have a piece of a scarab or maybe even an entire scarab. And we also have, people always ask me this about archaeological sites. Do you guys ever use metal detectors? Yes, the answer is absolutely. We have a metal detectorist, and what is her name? Ellen, I think, was our metal detector. I think she's still part of our ABR team. She's probably in Shiloh now, but she will go through all the squares with her metal detector, and she has been able to discover coins, things like that, in these squares. So that's dry sifting. What it looks like. This is, again, just showing you what the site of it looks like. At the end of the day, what you do, if you go to an archaeological site, you take the bucket that you dug up with all your pottery in it, and guess what you get to do? You get to wash that pottery. So you get to have a little dishwashing episode, but there's a water hose, and they have a whole little thing there. It usually takes about 45 minutes, 45 minutes or so, not long, and you wash the pottery. And then they take the pottery and they have a pottery reading. And that is, where is Scott? That's Dr. Wood right there. That's Dr. Brian Wood. That's Gary Byers. Gary is the one who co-founded this site. He actually discovered the site with Dr. Brian Wood. And they're actually having a pottery reading. I think I have a picture of Scott too. Yeah, there's Scott. So Scott was the assistant director of Kermit McCotter at the time. And now he is now serving as the chief, now I think he was actually the director of Kermit McCotter, but he's now digging at Shiloh. This guy here is a Tel Aviv University, I think, and he is an expert pottery reader. So they have guys that actually spend their entire life studying pottery, and you can actually tell the dates of these different layers by the shape of the pottery. And then we also discover, in archaeological sites, we discover objects. I mentioned scarabs earlier, these little small beetle-shaped objects, and we record those in a database at the end of the day. Yes, question?
What's a scarab?
A scarab is a little beetle. It's a beetle used in ancient Egypt. It was a symbol of, Egyptians believed it was a symbol of resurrection. There's a whole other little backstory to that. You want to hear the backstory? Real quick, here's the backstory. Why are these important to Egyptians? Because the Pharaoh, throughout his life, wanted to protect his heart. He wanted to protect his heart because the heart, according to the ancient Egyptians, would be weighed by the gods in the afterlife. The heart, if the heart was hard and heavy, the heart would outweigh the feather of Ma'at, and the heart would be condemned in the afterlife. So in order to protect the heart, the Pharaoh would embalm his body with a mummy with a scarab placed over the heart to keep the heart soft. What do we read about in the Exodus account? When God sent the plagues, what did Pharaoh do to his heart? He hardened his heart. He hardened his heart, or God hardened the heart. So God was the one in control in the Exodus, not the Egyptian gods, not Pharaoh, but God was the one in control. So I think there's a lot lot that's going on there, but they literally, it has a little spell from the Egyptian Book of the Dead to keep the heart soft in the afterlife. And when you find these, they were worn as amulets, as a necklace, by those living to keep the heart soft while you're alive. And so at Kermit El-Makadar, guess what was discovered? In fact, in 2013, Christianity Today named it the top archaeological discovery of 2013. They found a scarab from the time of Thutmose III. Thutmose III was likely one of the Exodus pharaohs. There were two pharaohs that we look at, Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. And this is really not about the Exodus, but those are very, very important pharaohs. And so why was it in Israel at Kermit El-Makadar and found in the burn layer of Joshua? Very likely an Israelite who took it from Egypt and hung around his neck, it fell off his neck down at the site. Or did the Egyptians conquer the site? There's no evidence in the Egyptian records they conquered Ai, so this must be Hebrews coming out of the wilderness that did this. This is Roman glass that was discovered. There's a bead that was discovered. So let's go back to Mount Ebal. This is actually on top, I'm standing on top of Mount Ebal, where it was discovered. That was in 2014. That is behind me is the modern day city of Nablus. And in between that is the city of Shechem. This is the mikvah, the ritual bath that was discovered at Kermit El-Makadar. They also discovered underground a olive press and also an underground cistern that I actually crawled into and took some photographs and had a really tight squeeze. Another interesting thing, this is a little side thing here, in I think it was 2009 or 7, I can't remember the exact date, but one of my friends and colleagues who is now in Israel digging with Scott, in fact, she's Scott's, I think she's the assistant director now, her name is Abigail Levitt. Abigail crawled in here, you have to literally crawl on your elbows and literally with a headlamp on, and there was inside where they had the olive press, there was this hidden chamber, and she found, I think it was 7 or 9 skeletons that had bronze Roman arrowheads in them. And we believe that these were Jews that were killed during the during the Jewish war, when the Romans went to war against the Jews in 70 AD. And they were found, and we were trying to figure out how in the world, were they shot first? I guess they had to have been, and they crawled in there to try to hide from the Romans, but apparently they died in place, or maybe they were suffocated. But she found all the skeletons there in that little hole inside of the cistern. And there's me crawling out of it. So if you're claustrophobic, you probably would not want to crawl in there, but it was pretty cool. There's the Byzantine church on top of the site, the steps leading to the Byzantine church. These are mosaic tiles that we call tessera. You guys are Marvel fans, you have heard of the Tesseract if you're into the Marvel movies. Well, the word tessera just means a small cube. And it comes from archaeology, actually. These are mosaic tiles called tessera. And that was actually found. So a couple quick things here. There is the scarab from the 18th dynasty. It's either from the reign of Thutmose or Amenhotep II. And you say, well, how do you know that? Because there's actually scholars who study the iconography of scarabs, and they can identify with a really high degree of certainty which pharaoh it was and what the time frame is. So it's interesting that this scarab was discovered at Kermit El-Makadar, and it was in 2013. It was named one of the top 10 archaeological discoveries. There are some old photographs of scarabs. You find these all over Egypt and all over Israel as well. These are diagnostic artifacts that help us to date sites. Another thing that is discovered along the Bronze Age wall were this bronze arrowhead and a sling stone. So that was actually a friend of mine, Matt Glassman, discovered these in our square. Another thing that was discovered were infant jar burials. The Bible tells us that there were women and children at Ai. Skeptics say, no, there were no women and children. It was a military outpost. This actually shows us that, no, there were children at Ai, because there is a child burial here in this. This is what the Canaanites would do at that time, and it was discovered there at Ai. And they actually still had, some of the bones were actually preserved at the site. So this is actually Shiloh. This is actually in 2014, and I'm standing on what is one of the possible locations of the foundations of the tabernacle. We know that Joshua And after that, went and they were going to, their center of worship and their center of where they were going to separate in the land was going to be at Shiloh. And so the team is there now. In fact, I'm kind of jealous because they're all over there digging, and I just got back from Turkey, so I'm working on that project now. But they also discovered at Shiloh, back in, when was this? I think it was found about 3 years ago by Tim Lopez, who is one of our colleagues there. These are actually the same thing from different angles. These are ceramic pomegranates. Now, we know that the Jews used pomegranates on the priestly robes. And that's right. And these very likely could have been covered in gold or some type of other silver or something like that. And we believe that they were actually tied. It doesn't look like a pomegranate, but trust me, it is, because we have other pomegranates that are found in Israel that look very similar. But it was found in Locus 7, Stratum 3, dating to the Iron Age, showing us that Shiloh was used as a site that they were worshiping Yahweh. In fact, Scott believes they may have another announcement, because I think they're right on the edge of finding the foundation stones of the tabernacle at Shiloh, which is so important because this was the actually most important site in Israel before David established the temple in Jerusalem. They were at Shiloh first, and for 400 years it was the capital of Israel. All throughout the Judges period, Samuel, in fact, was there and did his service at Shiloh. And so Shiloh is a very important part of history of the Old Testament. And notice there, this is the rectangular platform. In fact, the Bible tells us that God commanded the Israelites to camp around the tabernacle. And all on these hills, they have found artifacts that date from the same time period. Isn't it awesome? So now, let's fast forward the clock and come back to our tablet inscription. So after Joshua and the Israelites, after they defeat Ai, what does he do? When you read the text, he goes to Shechem and he renews the covenant with God at Shechem. Mount Ebal, the curses mountain, and Mount Gerizim, the blessings mountain. And he said, and on the curses mountain, the curses are recited. This goes back to Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. This is known by Old Testament scholars as the Deuteronomic principle, that it's a principle of basically God telling the Jews that if you obey my voice, and if you follow my law, if you follow my Torah, if you follow me with all your heart and love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, I will bless you and I will bring you into the land. But if you disobey me, then I will bring upon you all the curses. In fact, the curses section in Deuteronomy 28 is much longer than the blessing section. And so when they were renewing the covenant, they were basically telling God, we will keep the covenant. Now we know they didn't keep the covenant. They couldn't. They tried and they failed. Who was the one to always keep the covenant in that relationship? It was God. He was the one. We are covenant breakers. He is the covenant keeper. In fact, the Hebrew word hesed literally means chesed. You have to say it with an A. Chesed literally means it means covenant faithfulness. It's been translated different ways in English Bible, but it can mean loving kindness, grace, love, but literally means covenant faithfulness. When they fail, God is going to keep his word. So now has been discovered a curses tablet from the actual site of the curses mountain with in the context of an altar site, and has this on it. Here is the translation. It's an amulet that contains, folks, sometimes I try to be very measured in my presentation, but it's kind of hard to hold back because it's so incredible. The amulet contains 40 proto-alphabetic letters. This is really old. And if this is right, the dating on this is correct, 11 of which are Aleph. In the 23rd English translation, the inscription, the word curse appears 10 times and Yahweh appears twice. It appears to be a parallelism, which basically, it was basically when you sealed that little curse tablet, you were basically telling God, and you put it on the curses altar, you're basically telling God, let these curses fall on me if I don't keep my word, basically. It's kind of like when you go, when you get married and you give your wife the ring or whatever, and you're making a covenant. You're renewing that covenant. It is right here at that altar that we find this. Now, the significance of this, not merely for the fact that it affirms Old Testament history, but it blows away liberal scholarship, liberal scholars or skeptics who say that the Israelites, there was no Exodus, there was no conquest. Israelites, in fact, Moses could not have written the Pentateuch because he couldn't have written the Ten Commandments because written language was not invented yet. There you go, Proto-Hebrew, right there. It's the oldest, in fact, the two older inscriptions. One is called the Kuntalit Arjun inscription. It's actually found on a jar found in the desert in the southern part of Israel. And the next oldest inscription was actually found by Gabriel Barkai, who was a Jewish Israeli archaeologist in the Temple Mount Siping project. He found a silver scroll called the Ketif Hinnom scroll. And so this predates that by years. This is really old. This is like the Dead Sea Scrolls, except older, way older. And this shows us that Hebrew was written very early in Israeli history, Jewish history, and it's found and associated in a site that we know from the Hebrew Bible is associated with a major event in Jewish history. Now, let me say this about this discovery. And so far, and there is the name. In fact, it's the Yod, the YHWH. This is in fact they say the people that have studied this, paleographers. This is on the outside of the lead tablet. The lead tablet, by the way, was taken to a lab, and it was actually scanned by an X-ray, super high-tech X-ray scanner, and it was a tomographic scan was done on it, in which they layer through this lead. I didn't think that X-rays, but it apparently can be X-rayed, and they go through and peel the layers back one by one, and when they did that, that's when the writing appeared. You couldn't even see it. In fact, they knew it was a lead curse tablet inscription, but they didn't know how old it was. These are super old letters because the Hebrew language had not yet been standardized. And the way that they wrote it out hadn't been standardized, so you could put the letters in any way you want, and it would actually, you could read it in that manner. So Scott, in my interview that I did with him, and actually you can find this on my YouTube channel. Go to Epic Archaeology YouTube channel, and I interviewed Dr. Scott Stripling about this. We've got about an hour interview on that, and I asked him because they made a press release of this inscription there in Houston, Texas, at the Lanier Theological Library, and he had on the Zoom presentation some of the Israeli and Dutch scholars that were paleographers with him. So it wasn't just Scott saying this, these are our international team, but they did a press release, and it has not yet been peer reviewed. But it's going to be peer reviewed in the fall. So I asked him, and one of the questions you may have is, well, why was this announced and it has not yet been peer reviewed? That's the very question I asked Scott. I was like, so Scott, let me ask you the $64,000 question. Why did you guys release this as a major discovery and it has not yet been evaluated or looked at by paleographers? And his answer was that basically this is such a sensitive subject, and there was a lot of emails going back and forth between himself and Europe, and there was some concern that someone else may have taken credit for the discovery, and they wanted to basically put their flag on it and say, we're studying this is our discovery, it's under peer review process right now. In fact, it's going to be peer reviewed in the fall, but so far, all the evidence seems to point to that it is greatly significant. Now, one scholar who he always is very skeptical of anything that the Old Testament has to say when it comes to historical reliability, and that is at George Washington University, and I cannot think of his name off the top of my head. What is his name? Robert, do you know the guy? It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, he's a paleographer. He basically said this is premature, and he even sort of showed his hand in Biblical Archaeology Review magazine. They did a little magazine press release on this discovery, and he basically said that even if it's shown to be legitimate, we should still be skeptical and not put a lot of faith in it. Like, you're just showing no matter what, I mean, you liberals will say, well, you shouldn't believe the Bible unless there's evidence. Well, now we got evidence. Well, not that evidence. Well, I mean, it's like they keep pushing the goalposts back, but it is greatly significant, and it fits a pattern of evidence that we see from the Exodus to the conquest, now to going into the Judges period, and even in some of the more recent periods in the Old Testament history, such as the Iron Age. But this is a huge discovery, and it is going to be interesting to see how it plays out in the future. So I will stop there because we're about out of time, and I know you may have questions about this. But any other quick questions before we take a quick break here? Yes.
I've seen the YHWH before, but I've never seen YHWH.
Yes, and that is an interesting question. But so I'm not a paleographer, but my understanding is that they compare these letters and their associations, and I think there's variations on that throughout Old Testament history, found in some of the older sites, some of the more recent sites in Israel, like in the Iron Age. So I think there's a variation on the spelling of Yahweh from these early Hebrew inscriptions. And I think that's one of them. But this is super, super early. And so it had not been standardized yet. Now, I haven't even talked about my colleague, Doug Petrovich, who, let me see if I've got a slide real quick. I'm just going to pop one slide if I can find it, because I want you to see the context of this. Let's see here. Yeah, here it is, right here. So, one of my colleagues, Doug Petrovich, has a book out called The World's First Alphabet. And it caused a lot of waves when it was released. And what Doug says is that basically the Hebrew language started actually in Egypt. And it shows up in the Sinai Peninsula at several places where he believes that the Jews were employed by the Pharaoh, or at least some of them, some of the family of Joseph and his brothers, were employed by the Pharaoh to mine turquoise in the Sinai Peninsula. In the Sinai Peninsula, at Servet el-Hadim and Wadi el-Hol, they find these proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. And they know their Semitic language, and they know they're very old, but these inscriptions have elements of Hebrew and elements of Egyptian hieroglyphics, and they have not yet been standardized. They show up, get this now, they show up about the time of Joseph, and they get more and more developed up to the time of the Exodus in 1446 BC. And then, get this, one of the inscriptions actually, this one here, this is known as the Exodus, the Servet el-Hadim, Moses inscription. It literally says this in this Sinai 361. It says, "Our bound servitude had lingered. Moses then provoked astonishment. It is the year of astonishment because of the lady." So, in these very, very early Proto-Hebrew / Egyptian texts, these slaves are basically saying that we were slaves for a long time, and then somebody named Moses came along and provoked astonishment, and then guess what? That was in 1446 BC, the time of the Exodus. These inscriptions and this language disappears out of Egypt, out of the Sinai. It disappears for several years, and guess where it shows back up? Mount Ebal, right there. Boom. That's the significance of this. It's stitching together. You've got Israel and Egypt. They're there in the wilderness. They're wandering for 40 years. Then they go into Canaan. They conquer Jericho. They conquer Ai. And then Scott finds this inscription on Mount Ebal that stitches together this language. Now, this has not been widely accepted by paleographer. Chris Rolston, that's the guy, George Washington University. Chris Rolston has been very critical of Doug Petrovich and others, and also Kenneth Kitchen, who's an Egyptologist at the University of London. Now, what you may not know about this is that Dr. Petrovich has said this publicly when he was publishing this book on the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, saying this is early Hebrew. He invited Kenneth Kitchen and Chris Rolston to evaluate his work. He says, listen, check this out, check me out. They refused. And then when he publishes it, they come out and say, you should have checked with other people. He said, well, I tried to check with you, and you never did, you never did get back with me. So this is pretty cool stuff. And that is really the context of the this is the possible connection. Now again, I'm jumping the gun here. I'm trying to connect the dots with you to show you where this might go. But as of yet, just to be honest and very transparent with you, what I just shared with you about the Mount Ebal inscription is just literally released 2 months ago. And it is under the peer review process. But I'm confident that it's going to stand the test and that it's going to come out as one of the greatest. In fact, even in the Jewish press, in the Israeli newspapers, it has come out as a major discovery, even by the Jews, even by some of the more skeptical, liberal Jewish newspapers in Israel are saying this is greatly significant. So it's an exciting time to be alive as a Christian, to see these evidences come to light. And there's more to come. So thank you.
Thank you.